Welcome. My name is Mike Duncan, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of the Mike Duncan channel. I am the co-author of the book, The New Founders, book I wrote a number of years ago with my good friend Joe Connor, book in which we bring George Washington back to life today in modern day, where he meets up with six individuals who are kind of embodiments or reincarnations of six of the founding fathers. And altogether, they go into the society and try and change the hearts and minds of Americans to bring them back to founding father principles. We wrote the book in 2012, and it did have a profound effect on people. We bring Washington back through divine providence, and that is the topic of today's discussion. Basically, President Trump, and we are now within a week of his inauguration, and the question out there is, was he delivered by divine providence? There are many instances in U.S. history where I believe divine providence intervened to keep this country going, keep this country afloat. I believe God realized this country was special and helped it along on many instances where the country could have fallen apart right away, but continued on. In its infancy, in our infancy, I look to a couple of different events per se, mostly within the revolutionary times. Now, I think divine providence played a wider role early on too in the with the Mayflower and the original settlers here. But I always point to the Revolutionary War because there are multiple instances within the Revolutionary War where I believe divine providence intervened, and the most notable was right at the outset of the war. We had declared independence on July 4th, 1776, and a month later, we were entrenched in a battle with the British in Brooklyn, the Battle of Brooklyn, or some call it the Battle of Long Island, where Washington's troops were entrenched in what is now today, if you look at a map of New York City, it's Brooklyn Heights, and the British were advancing from the south. They had brought a number of troops in on ships coming into the New York harbor, and they were advancing north through Brooklyn up towards the Heights where the U.S. troops were settled. Unbeknownst to those U.S. troops, and unbeknownst to Washington at the time, the British were also advancing from the east and the northeast in what was, if you look at a map today, it's the Jamaica Queens section of Long Island, or at the time, Long Island. And they were moving in from the northeast as well as the south and pretty much had the U.S. troops surrounded. So Washington and his troops were pretty much surrounded in the Brooklyn Heights area. The British were advancing, and they decided to take a breather that night before advancing the next day. Washington saw this time with the British holding tight around them. He saw it as a good sign to retreat and try and get out of Brooklyn and try and make it across the river into Manhattan, away from Brooklyn Heights. And what happened was they were trying to get the troops together, get their boats together to get all the troops out of Brooklyn to Manhattan. But the thing was, the major issue was sound, troop movement. They didn't want to alert the British to their plans, so they were trying to do the whole movement, to the boats across the river as stealthy as possible. But they were having trouble doing that. And then what happened was, in the middle of the night, as they were closing in on the dawn, a fog rolled into the area, a fog over Brooklyn, a fog that was as thick as pea soup. You couldn't see a couple feet in front of you. What was wild about this is the type of fog you never see in downtown Brooklyn, on the East River like that. But it rolled in at such a perfect time that it gave Washington and his troops cover. They were able to get on the boats, get into the water, get across to Manhattan, and it took many boats to move all the troops. Washington, he was told by his soldiers to get on a boat and go. Washington waited till the last troops were out, and he got on that last boat to come across. So that, come daybreak, when the fog started to lift, the British advanced to find the Americans had escaped. I always say this is the first real instance of divine providence, because that fog rolling in allowed Washington and his troops to get out of Brooklyn, get to Manhattan and fight, live to fight another day. Something that was kind of uncommon at the time, is still uncommon today, to see a fog that thick roll in, basically where the Brooklyn Bridge is right now in modern day. And again, an instance of divine providence where if this fog hadn't rolled in, the British would have surrounded Washington. Washington would have had to surrender, and the war would have been over, in less than 2 months. So I always point to that as the first instance of divine providence. Second, being a few years later, the Battle of Trenton. Now everybody is very familiar with the Washington crossing the Delaware. Everybody's heard this story from grade school. Everybody's seen the painting, but it wasn't as easy as was originally taught in grade school. Basically, Washington wanted to do a sneak attack on the British in Trenton on Christmas night. They had arranged to cross the Delaware in the longboats, the famous longboats. But not only was it troops, they were bringing cannons, they were bringing horses, they were bringing armaments. And if you've heard stories about the weather in the area over those few years of the Revolutionary, you might have heard stories about Valley Forge or Jockey Hollow in New Jersey, some of being the coldest winters ever. The Delaware River was full of chunks of ice, and I mean big flotillas of ice. So the crossing of the Delaware wasn't as easy as was originally expected. It took many, many hours to do so, to get everybody across. And once they got across and they started south on their advance to Trenton, by this time it was 4 or 5 in the morning when they were expecting to do it shortly after midnight. So that march, it isn't like marching across the street. It takes time. It was very cold. There were soldiers who didn't make the trip. They passed away on the trip. There were many soldiers who got frostbite on the walk. But by the time they did get to Trenton, the sun had risen. So their plan of coming in the dark under cover of night, that went out the window. But what didn't go out the window was, as they approached Trenton, another snowstorm, and snow and ice storm actually came upon the area. Basically, the British, who had been having fun the night before, being Christmas night, they were staying in a little later anyway. But with the snow and the ice, they decided to stay in longer in the morning, basically giving the Americans a ton of time to fortify their armaments, fortify their positions on the higher ground overlooking the British, the British installment, where the British and Hessians were sleeping in their bunks, sleeping in the camps, in the buildings and in the barricades and the buildings and all that they were they were housed in. And what happened was, when the Americans moved in, it was really a real surprise attack. The British were not ready for it. They were not ready to battle. And what was supposed to be a very tough fight became a quick battle, quick win for the Americans. And not only was it just a quick win, but it also it really energized the Americans, energized the soldiers, energized the populace. Basically, at that point, American morale was pretty low. And at that point, the win, really, the word got out on the win, and it did energize the populace, and it led to more victories. The following Trenton was the Battle of Princeton, and then victories from there. It gave the Americans confidence that they could fight with the British, whereas up till then they had been suffering defeat after defeat. But again, the plan didn't go as planned. They got there by daybreak, but instead of being under the cover of darkness, cover of night, they were able to set up their arms and set up their trenches and everything under the cover of a snowstorm, and it led to a win. So again, another instance of divine providence coming in, assisting the U.S. troops. And then, of course, the battle that ended the war, the Battle of Yorktown. Basically, this was an advance of the U.S. troops on the British encampments in Yorktown. The French were coming in from the ocean, as everybody knows who's studied the Revolutionary War. And what happened was, Cornwallis saw the advance of the Americans and were digging in. But on back-to-back nights, there were clouds or whatever caused it. It wasn't so much a big rainstorm, but there were clouds that came in at night, back to back nights, that blocked out the moon. So they had a moonless night, back to back nights, where the Americans could dig their trenches, get in good place for the attack on the British and Cornwallis and his troops, and were able to fight. So the second night, when Cornwallis saw that the troops had advanced on them, he decided to escape on flatboats across the York River to safer ground for the British, and he started his retreat. The first batch of troops got across no problem. It was good weather, wasn't too bad at all. But as they started to put the second and third and fourth flatboats out, a squall came in, a storm came in, and what it did was scatter those boats. They really couldn't control them, couldn't direct them, and multiple boats ended up towards the Chesapeake Bay where the French Navy was coming in. And the British troops were immediately attacked from the French and were captured for the most part. Cornwallis, while he only got a small group of soldiers to safe ground across the York River, they were totally overmatched and outmanned by the U.S. troops. And as history goes, they were forced to surrender. So again, a crucial battle in the Revolutionary War, where some sort of weather event, or as I say, divine providence, intervened in favor of the U.S., in favor of America. And this was just at our infancy. It was when we were most vulnerable and we were most ready to fall apart. And multiple instances in the Revolutionary War where divine providence intervened in the form of a fog, form of a storm, form of cloudless night, a moonless night. So multiple instances in Revolutionary War that come to mind. Then a few years later, a lot of people don't remember this war too well. You might have learned about it in grade school, but the War of 1812. It's a war that was kind of a two-front war for Britain when they were fighting us and fighting the French. It started with a naval blockade of Britain against U.S. merchant ships, really hampered our economy, hurt our economy, and we ended up going to war for it. And one notable instance in the War of 1812 was the attack on Washington by the British. In the summer of 1814, the British advanced into Washington. They pretty much ended their war with France. Napoleon had escaped, and the French were really no longer an enemy to them for the most part, or no longer an opponent. And they turned all their forces on the U.S. They advanced into Washington and started burning everything in sight in Washington: houses, buildings, barns, anything they can get their hands on. They started burning down, and they were pretty much about to advance and take over Washington when what happened? A tornado appeared. Tornado came down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building, where the British soldiers were encamped, and pretty much wrecked all the British armaments. The word was that the tornado was flinging cannons like toys, killed a number of British soldiers, and the rain from the storm where the tornado was part of put out a lot of the fires that the British had started. So again, divine providence intervening when we could have been really hurt. Maybe we could have been become British again. Who knows what would have happened if they had taken over Washington, D.C. It is funny. There is an account the next day where, as the British troops, the ones who were left, were retreating out of the city, one of the soldiers of the British Army saw a local lady and asked if these type of storms were what's the word I'm looking for? If they were accustomed to these types of storms in the Washington, D.C. area. And the lady answered, "No, sir. This is a special interposition of providence to drive our enemies from the city." Now think of that. That's a person who experienced everything coming in and was quoting providence at that point in 1814. So again, another instance where weather, a weather instance, a quick weather instance, helped American troops and kept our country afloat. And for those, few weather buffs out there, I'm a weather buff. When was the last time you saw a tornado go down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C.? It never happens. So that's why I like to think that Providence intervened in keeping this country going. And it was still our infancy. We'd only been around for 30, 40 years at that point. And then if you look at the bigger picture too, who was the father of our country? Who was leading the country through the Revolution times? It was George Washington. And a lot of people like to say that George Washington was a beneficiary of divine providence himself. Most people don't know that George Washington, he made a name for himself, leading regiments, leading troops in during the French Indian War. He was very young. He was in his 20s, early 20s, as a matter of fact, when he was leading men into battle, and not just leading them, but he was in battle himself. He was in the trenches, on the front lines. Um, this is a gentleman who was shot multiple times through the clothes, through his lapels, through his sleeves, through his hat. Yet none of the musket balls that ever were shot at him ever touched his body. He never suffered a scratch. It's a guy who had multiple horses below him killed while riding. Multiple horses were shot and were dead that he was riding, yet he was never touched by a musket ball. There were many instances where he had to get off a dead horse and jump on another horse. Most times it was the horse carrying a dead soldier who had been killed in battle, where he had to push the soldier off, hop on the horse, and go into battle again. What most people don't know, too, is during the French Indian War, he had multiple instances where he suffered dysentery. He even had smallpox, a case of smallpox during that time. Those, two or three, dysenteries, one case of smallpox, that's enough to kill an ordinary man. Yet he survived through those and fought, lived to fight another day. Now think about that. Again, that's divine providence, in my opinion. The illnesses, the being shot at, having clothes ripped apart by musket balls and hats ripped apart by musket balls, yet not even having a scratch on his body. That's why I like to think that George Washington was a product of divine intervention. Divine intervention kept him alive, kept him around to lead us through the revolution, to become our first president, to form our government that we still follow to this day. He was way ahead of his time. He's a guy who could have been king, but turned it down. And so, with that said, I like to move to the gentleman who's going to be our 47th president, Donald Trump. When he ran in 2016, I told many people that I think it was divine providence that brought him to us for the presidency. Here's a guy who had a great life. He had his money, he had his real estate, he had a TV show, family, the whole thing. He didn't have to run for president. Years ago, I remember when he was on Oprah Winfrey. There's a clip that's floating around the internet now. He was on Oprah Winfrey, and Oprah asked him if he'd ever run for president, and he said, if the country needed me, I would. Well, I guess in 2015, 2016, he deemed that the country needed him, and he decided to run. And I remember at the time I did a couple speeches basically on divine providence intervening in America. And I always ended those speeches with saying, I think divine providence delivered Donald Trump. It was after 8 years of the Obama administration where basically everything Obama did was anti-American, from, the, pushing the abortion and everything else you see on the internet now, to giving Iran pallets of cash and basically, bowing to other countries' leaders. It didn't make sense. It was all un-American, anti-American. And I thought Donald Trump was delivered to us at that time by divine providence to get this country back on track and basically to give the country a reprieve. Here's a guy who, according to all the polls, whether you believe the polls or not, was way behind Hillary Clinton in the weeks leading up and still won in what was technically a landslide at the time. And then for 4 years as president, the guy did amazing things. He fixed the economy. He got people being proud of America again, all while fighting the folks across the aisle. The Russian collusion hoax, the two impeachments, and continued to battle on and did some amazing things. It's amazing what he accomplished in such a short time, fighting all of that. And then come 2020, when President Biden was thrust upon us, and I do say that tongue in cheek. I don't think he ever realized what he was doing, to tell you the truth. We saw a lot of the Obama stuff come back in multiples, and Donald Trump had been through hell with the first term. He accomplished so much. He did great things. He was fighting. His character was questioned. His reputation was abused, but he still went on. And there was all the question of whether he was going to run again for the election of 2024, and he decided to do so. And then what happens? He starts his campaign. And in the summer, this past summer, everybody remembers when he was in Pennsylvania and he was given that speech and he was shot. We're talking about, a guy on a rooftop with a big gun and a scope from a couple hundred yards away with, clear shot at President Trump. President Trump was speaking. He turned his head to look at the screen and the bullets flew and nicked his ear, and all of that. You can believe what you want. Maybe the guy was a bad shot. Maybe the turning of his head at the precise moment helped. But in my opinion, it was divine providence. Divine providence either moved his head or divine providence pushed the bullets to the side. It wasn't his time, even though President Trump probably should have been killed that day. And the funny part is there was a lady reporter who was supposed to interview him after the speech that day. She was sitting in the front row, and she was interviewed on Fox News the next morning and said she had been around guns all her life and was a good shooter herself. And she said there were multiple calibers of bullets flying around Trump. So whether you want to believe a conspiracy theory or not, multiple shooters, whatnot, Trump probably should have been dead that day. And I think divine providence intervened to save his life. And everybody remembers the images of the blood on the ear and the fight with the fist up. I think that opened his eyes and he said, I'm here, I'm here for a reason, and it's God who intervened to keep me going. I truly believe that when he says that. And then not too long after that, when he was on the golf course, another time where there was a shooter close by, only about a hole or two away. Secret Service saw something, somebody reported something, whatever story you want to believe. That person did get away, didn't get a shot off at him, and then was eventually captured. That's divine providence. That way, if he had come up to that hole and nobody noticed that gun poking through the bush, he would have been an easy shot. He would have been point blank for the shooter. Think about it. That shooter, how did he even know that Trump was supposed to be there? It wasn't on the itinerary, wasn't on his official schedule. So crazy as it sounds, I think divine providence played a part there as well. And then, of course, the election itself. Now, you could say all you want that Trump was the superior candidate, and he was, whether it would have been Biden or Kamala. But again, the latest instance of divine providence was Trump winning the election and being nominated for and about to be the 47th president of the United States. You can't convince me otherwise. That it's divine providence that he's here for a second time, because this country wasn't in good shape after the past 4 years, and I think he's here to save this country and to make it great again. It's his slogan. I believe it. So take it for what it's worth, but I think Trump is here by divine providence. He was delivered to us by divine providence, and you won't be able to dissuade me on that. So anyway, thanks for listening in. You can check out our blog site at www.thenewfounders.org. And you can also look for the book online as well, where a lot of divine providence is through there too. Anyway, there'll be more to come in the coming months. We're going to be talking more sports, more current events, more politics, more history, and whatever is the hot topic of the day. So look forward to speaking with you then. Take care.